Alright, let's talk about how long it should be. And yes, how you use it matters. The simple and completely unhelpful answer is, whatever sword length works best for you. Well, that is kind of how a statement by the 15th century Italian fencing master Fiore reads when he talks about a good sword that is not too long. Presumably it's not too short either. Maybe that's what good old George Silver had in mind when he ranted about how the Italians don't teach or define perfect weapon length. Let's read a bit of Di Vadi, who says, it should be of a length to come with the pommel under the arm. The handle should be of a span. Capoferro, also Italian. The sword has to be twice as long as the arm, or from the armpit to the sole of my foot. Sorry, George. That's what you get when you lump people together and make overgeneralized statements. It only takes one to debunk you. It's interesting to note that both Di Vadi and Capoferro define the ideal length as the same, even though they're talking about very different swords. Di Vadi's talking about long swords, Capoferro is talking about rapiers. And it just so happens that the two I have here are pretty much identical in length. When I put them on the ground, both almost reach up to my armpit. Not quite, they're a little bit shorter, but pretty close. I should point out that in this video I'm talking about the question, what's the ideal length for a particular type of sword. You can also compare different types of swords and make statements about what's better and worse, which Silver did. He wasn't too fond of how long rapiers are and preferred shorter blades. There are pros and cons to the length. How do you find out what's the ideal sword length for you? And is there even such a thing as the ideal length? I think that's debatable. The problem is that there are a lot of factors going into it. Height is the obvious one. Limb length also makes a difference because not everybody at the exact same height has the same limb proportions. So one person might have shorter or longer arms. And then also strength comes into play because the longer you make the blade, of course, the heavier it gets, and generally the more forward weighted it is. So a stronger person should be able to handle a longer blade with the same speed. It's not just about speed. The length also affects other mechanics, like in binding and winding. If we think about the distinction between the strong and the weak of the blade. So the upper third, the weak, is what you cut with. That's where the leverage works in your favor. But if your opponent applies pressure against it, now they can use that leverage against you. The longer it is, the longer the lever is, and the easier it is for the opponent to control your blade. Of course, reach is a significant advantage. A taller fighter might be able to hit when the shorter fighter can't even threaten. Which is why Capoferro points out that the laws in some places standardize blade length to not amplify the already existing natural reach advantage that a taller fighter has. And of course, no matter how tall you are, there's almost always someone who will dwarf you. Okay, reach is great, so why not get the longest sword you can find so you can leisurely be all the way over here and threaten to poke them from this far away? Well, it comes at a price, because the longer the blade is, the more weak you have. So if an opponent has a sword that weighs the same but is shorter, that means they have more blade presence, because the blade is shorter but also wider and or thicker. So if they manage to bind your longer, flimsier blade, you're in trouble, especially if they manage to put their strong on your weak and move in, because now it's hard for you to even disengage because it's this much to work with, right? It's this much to move around before they can close in to really bind you up, if they can manage. That's easier said than done if you're good at controlling distance and denying them the bind, constantly slipping out, moving around, constantly threatening them. That's a lot more difficult that way. But those are the inherent pros and cons of blade length.
It's interesting that George Silver explicitly warned against trying to compensate for a shorter height with a longer blade to make up for the reach disadvantage. His standpoint was that the lower maneuverability of the longer blade relative to a shorter height and arm length is more of a detriment than the gain in reach can balance out. Obviously, Italian fencers whom he had so much disdain for had very different opinions on maximum blade length. If you can't decide or want to be more adjustable, you can always get one of those fancy extending rapiers. I've made a video about those before if you haven't seen that, link below.
There may be certain rules and recommendations depending on the tradition and the weapon. For example, I've heard that in Chinese swordsmanship, the rule of thumb for a dao is if you hold it straight down, the point is not supposed to touch the ground. And George Silver has a very specific recommendation. He says that the blade is to be 1 yard and 1 inch for men of mean stature, and for men of tall stature, 1 yard and 3 or 4 inches and no more. He also has a more general rule of thumb for sword and dagger, where if you hold a dagger in front of you, the sword blade is not supposed to extend past the dagger if you keep your elbow bent, which is the case with this side sword here, but not with this rapier. That would be too long for that rule. Now, personally, I think with a dagger, you can afford more blade length. If they manage to bind and constrain your blade and come in, you still have something else to work with. You can still intercept that, try to free the blade, work with that, or even attack with the dagger if need be. Recommendations for sword lengths can be a little bit arbitrary, because while it's easy enough to determine the extremes, okay, this blade is too long, you keep getting stuck, you have trouble handling it, and this is so short, you could make use of a bit more reach. There's something in between, right? So where you want to define the boundary is somewhat subjective and it's pretty difficult. The same way as how do you distinguish where a long dagger ends and a short sword starts. Measurements generally fail because whatever hard point you want to set, okay, up to this and that exact length, okay, what if it's 1 centimeter above? Is this something else? Not really, it still looks the same. So going by body measurements makes more sense to me. For example, you could say something like the length of an arming sword should roughly extend from your center of your chest to your fingertips. The tricky thing is whatever rule you want to come up with is specific to that sword type for the most part. You can't even say single-handed swords in general. It doesn't really work. You can't even really say two-handed swords, because there are different formats, if you will. You can have a shorter hand and a half sword, you can have a longer long sword, you can have a two-handed Scottish sword, which is somewhere in between a long sword and a great sword. There's so many specific cases, and personal preference does matter too. Oh no, it's another one of those, it depends. And finally, it also depends on the application. Battlefield versus formal duel versus self-defense on the street, it's quite different. So for self-defense, you might want something shorter, like this messer here. This is great for carrying around in everyday life. It can even double as a tool. It comes in handy in confined spaces. It's useful up close, even when grappling, but it would be at a disadvantage against a much longer weapon in an open space. So everything has pros and cons, as usual. Anyway, hope you found this interesting. Thanks for watching, and take care, folks.